Shaggy Dog Stories, 2 novels of Odysseus's dog Argos. I'm just going to present a brief summary of an introduction to the novels and the paper that I'm going to contribute to the Nature volume, which are Argos, the story of Odysseus as told by his loyal dog, published in 2016 by HarperCollins, by Ralph Hardy. He's an American author of young adult children's and also adult fiction, as well as a professor of English. This is essentially a retelling of the Odyssey, but from a first-person viewpoint of Argos, the dog. The emphasis on Argos's loyalty is there from the beginning, from the title indeed, and again from the blurb on the back cover. It emphasizes that it's from the point of view of the steadfast companion who never gives up hope of his master's safe return. The back cover gives a publisher's age recommendation of 8 to 12 years. Very similar in a lot of ways is Argos, Loyalty Has No Limits, also published in 2016 by the New Zealand author Philip W. Simpson, who's a children's and young adult fiction writer, also an education writer, and has years of experience in primary school teaching. It's the story of Argos's life in Odysseus's absence, so in part an Odyssey retelling, but not in the same way. It's more focused on Argos's life itself. It's a first-person narration again by Argos, and that emphasis on loyalty is again there from the subtitle, Loyalty Has No Limits, and again is emphasized on the back cover. It's an epic myth of love and loyalty, which proves that a dog really is man's best friend. This one, although it has no recommended age range stated by the publisher anywhere, is, I would say, aimed at a very similar kind of audience. Its first publisher, Month 9 Books, works in the teens and tweens fantasy and fiction market, according to their own website. So published in the same year, the same first-person narration by Argos, emphasis on loyalty. Other common features, of course, the whole premise is the same. It's based on a very small amount of text in the Odyssey itself, mainly this memorable and pathetic scene of the loyal dog Argos waiting for Odysseus' return and then dying shortly after, finally being reunited with his master after 20 years when he's been away at Troy and the adventures afterwards. So that happens in book 17 of the Odyssey. So the premise combines that with, of course, a modern love of pets to make the animal a central figure, and the relationship between master and dog, between owner and animal companion, much less commonly a theme of ancient literature, the dominant feature of these two retellings. So it comes against a widespread background of literature that's either for children or very popular with children and young adult audiences in the modern era, where the animal is at the center, or the relationship between an animal, especially a dog, and their owners or owner are the central feature. So one example is The Incredible Journey, a famous 1961 novel, and 2 different films based on it, about 2 dogs and a cat in that case, but separated from their human owners and traveling to get back to them. Argos's point of view, the fact that he's the narrator and it's from his perspective, are common features of the 2. And he's not fully anthropomorphized, so it's not, there are some versions of this kind of common feature of animal-centered literature, of course, anthropomorphizes animals to the extent where they have their own societies and social structures and so on. So Watership Down, another very famous example, novel and films and series based on it. In this case, the role of the central animal character remains that of Odysseus's dog, and that's just expanded on. So this all presents a common challenge to the two novelists. Argos, the dog, is absent from most of Odysseus's story. He's not there with him on his ship when he goes to Troy and all of the adventures afterwards. He's back home in Ithaca. So he's absent not only from the events, but even from all of their settings. It would be a huge divergence and rewrite of the narrative to include him, which is not what either of them do. So the central action of the Odyssey, they are separated, and that's what the novels have to deal with. But they also have to deal with the fact that Argos dies in book 17, and you've still got the second half of book 17, and then books 18 to 24 of the narrative of Odysseus to complete with the narrator having died. So there's a very limited role for Argos in the source material here. And as I hinted at already, it's a very different kind of literature that's not really exampled in Antiquity, this focus on animals. There's limited ancient models for an animal-centered narrative of this kind. So you've got, of course, Aesop's fables, but they're anthropomorphized animals and very short stories. So there are these shared challenges to the two novelists that they've kind of created for themselves by adopting this common premise, and they come up with two different solutions to this pair of challenges. So the first one, Hardy, as I mentioned in introducing him, he retells the main narrative elements of the Odyssey. It's a retelling of the Odyssey of Odysseus's adventures, and they're put in a chronological order, essentially. Argos, as the narrator, therefore has to tell us what happens when he's not there, either as a participant or as a witness. So how does he do that? He communicates with a natural world network of sources. He can track his master by hearing reports from other birds, other animals and birds who witness Odysseus's exploits at first hand or reports back at second hand from ones that did witness, and so on. So that's how you get around retelling the events of the Odyssey that don't take place in Ithaca, which is the most challenging part. And then the other challenge, the fact that Argos dies before the end. One facet of dealing with that is simply telescoping the events after his death. They're given less space in the narrative of the novel. About 15% of the novel happens after Argos's death, compared with about 30% of the events in the Odyssey happening after Argos's death. But the main way that prevents it coming to a complete halt after Argos, the narrator's death, is that we get a son, we get a pup, Leander, who takes up the story in book 3 of the novel. The novel is divided into books 1, 2, and 3. And this, from the very beginning, quotation from the beginning of book 3 of the novel. So the transition from books 2 to 3 is from the death of Argos to the taking up of the narrative by his pup, Leander. No blind poet has sung my story as they did my father, noble Argos, but I will tell it as it happened. I am the son of Argos, guardian companion to Telemachus, and my tale will be remembered by some, I think. So the narrative owns up to the fact that Leander is an invention. No blind poet has sung my story. So Homer doesn't mention the name Leander, doesn't mention Argos having a pup. But this device is created in order to finish the story, to round out the narrative of the Odyssey and Odysseus' adventures after Argos dies. And then finally, a different workaround, a different kind of novel, really, by Simpson, because the story is Argos's, not Odysseus's. So there's no attempt to retell all of Odysseus's adventures, the ones that Argos didn't witness, the ones that didn't take place on Ithaca. Instead, there's more emphasis on the parts of the narrative that are set in Ithaca, and then on Argos being present while Odysseus is absent, him as the guardian of the family and the loyal, faithful dog, looking after Penelope and Telemachus while Argos's master Odysseus is away. And then the other problem, Argos's death, is dealt with in a very different way. In this case, the dead narrator technique. So we get a narrator who is dead from the start and can narrate to us magically and witness things beyond his death and narrate beyond his death. So you get, before any of the chapters or even its prologue starts, you get an epigraph, which is the quotation from Odysseus, from the Odyssey, the part where Argos dies, and then the very first sentence of the author's own words after that quote from the Odyssey is the beginning of the prologue, page 1. So this is what it's like to die. And it's made very clear that the narrator, Argos, who introduces himself in that prologue, is already dead. And similarly, the first line of this first chapter on page 5, I awake only to discover that I have died. So he is already beyond the grave and narrating from beyond the grave. So it's a given of this technique, that he can narrate and can see things that happened after his death. So two very different solutions to these shared pair of problems that these authors have in common with the premise that they have. So that's just a brief snapshot of what I'll be looking into in the chapter into the narrative techniques of these two novels, how they are similar and how they differ, how they deal with this very similar premise in different ways, and build on that appeal, the combination of the already present pathos of that famous scene of the Odyssey with the animal appeal of modern children's literature. Thank you.